Hello and welcome to this video. I've been wanting to do something like this for so long and I'm so excited to finally be talking about my favorite books, recommending some good books to y'all and maybe getting some good book recommendations along the way. It is October 21st, I believe, so I'm gonna talk about my top 3 books for the year while also just caveating that I could change my mind because there are still prime reading months left in the year and I fully intend to take advantage of reading in November, December. I think it's the best time of the year to read when it's feeling a little more cozy. I'm wearing a sweatshirt, it's 90 degrees outside. You know, you just have to be a little bit delusional sometimes. The happiest people are not really tethered in reality. With all that aside, I am gonna jump right in and talk about my top 3 in no particular order because I think it would be an impossible task to order these 3 books. So the first book made me cry in the way that I want all books to make me cry. The writing style is absolutely stunning. The book is Hello Beautiful by Napolitano. This is a historical fiction book. It began in 1960 and goes all the way through 2008. I've always been so obsessed with quotes, and so I've gathered a few of my favorites from Hello Beautiful. Some of my favorite quotes are, "We're part of the sky and the rocks in your mother's garden and that old man who sleeps by the train station. We're all interconnected, and when you see that, you see how beautiful life is. Your mother and sisters don't have that awareness, not yet anyway. They believe they're contained in their bodies and the biographical facts of their lives. When your love for a person is so profound that it's part of who you are, then the absence of the person becomes part of your DNA, your bones, and your skin. The passage of time and the details that spun some moments into unforgettable memories and others into thin air traveled with Sylvie, the swirling atmosphere of her own life, while she walked." Hello Beautiful starts out following the story of this couple who are basically opposites. We have Julia, who's a type A overachiever who thinks she can fix William, the most introverted, and has some past trauma and comes from a family dynamic that is not as loving as Julia's. As you read further, you kind of get to see this couple's dynamic unfold, as well as the dynamic of Julia and her sisters, who are very Little Women-esque figures. And there are Little Women references throughout this book, which I absolutely love, as well as Walt Whitman. If you love to read, it's a great book because it talks about reading. Napolitano really weaves this tapestry of relationships over time, sibling relationships, parent-child relationships, cousins, long-lost family members, friends, and does a really good job showing the intricacies of different relationships and really making you feel like you're a part of the unfolding of these relationships. Your heartstrings are so tugged because they get so messy and it's so complicated across generations. This book does a really fantastic job in capturing themes of family, love, longing, and forgiveness. I absolutely adore Taylor Jenkins Reid and the way that she writes the most compelling, relatable characters. And I felt like Napolitano has that same talent for writing people and all of their nuance. This book made me feel how Carrie Soto and Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and all of the family members of Malibu Rising made me feel. This one was a little bit sadder than those books. I read this with a book club and I thought it was an amazing book club pick, especially reading fiction in book clubs can be so hit or miss, but this one was definitely a hit. Most people gave it 4 to 5 stars. And I think that if you like Taylor Jenkins Reid, Little Women, and The Vanishing Half, that you'll really enjoy Hello Beautiful. And then the inverse is also true. If you liked Hello Beautiful, I think that you would enjoy reading those 3 books. I tried to think about who might not like this book because I do really enjoy when people call that out. The beginning of the book was absolutely necessary to the story and building the characters up into what they were, but I do think that if you love plot and you like a little bit more of a fast-paced read, that this might be a little bit slow and boring at the beginning. I think that it's definitely worth it. Also, if you don't want your heart broken, you should stay away from this book. It did take me 2 weeks, which was maybe about average. I felt like I really wanted to savor every minute with these characters because I loved them so much. They were so frustrating to watch them make poor choices sometimes, but you always could like tell when they were making a decision based on their emotions. Like, you'd be like, oh my gosh, don't do that, but like I get why you're doing that based on the way that you grew up and the things that you believe and the way that you see the world. So I thought that this was just an amazing book, and I was researching a little bit and kind of reading around online about what people said about the book, and I came across this New York Times raving review of this book, and the title of the article is "It's Like Little Women, but with basketball." And I do think that that was another fun element in the book. William really liked to play basketball, and so we kind of got to see how sports can save people. That was just another fun little tidbit. This book has a lot of different really great elements that were all executed so well, and I would highly recommend this book. I annotated in this book so much, which I feel like I only do when I'm like really loving a book. So 5 out of 5 stars very easily for me, and definitely recommend. The next book that I want to talk about is by Madeline Miller, who is absolutely slaying words. She genuinely writes so beautifully. If you read Song of Achilles, you already know she's so good. She's another author who just really has a way with characters and builds complex stories, backgrounds, and nuance, and making you really feel like you're in the shoes of that character. The book is Circe, and this book was, I think, 380 pages, and I could have read 380 more, honestly. Like, I loved being in the world of Circe. This was a perfect combination of heartbreaking and powerful and hopeful. I would consider the genre fantasy, historical fiction. I don't know if we consider like Greek mythology historical fiction. She's a witch, so that was cool. A few quotes that stood out to me from this book were, "Humbling women seems to me a chief pastime of poets, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep. It is a common saying that women are delicate creatures, flowers, eggs, anything that may be crushed in a moment's carelessness. If I had ever believed it, I no longer did." And then this one just really stabs you in the heart. "When he was gone, would I be like Achilles, wailing over his lost lover Patroclus? I tried to picture myself running up and down the beaches, tearing at my hair, cradling some scrap of old tunic he had left behind, crying out for the loss of half my soul. I could not see it. That knowledge brought its own sort of pain." And I think that quote just sums up the complexity of the book so well, and the complexity of women's emotions. And Madeline Miller did a great job portraying those. Reading this book, you're thrown into the world of Greek mythology, which is one of my favorite fictional places to visit, and a place that I definitely want to start visiting a little bit more. Circe is the daughter of Helios, the god of the sun, and a nymph, Perse, who ends up being banished by Zeus to this secluded island to live out eternity by herself. She begins practicing witchcraft, finding her place on her island, and encountering very prominent historical, I say it as if it's true. I feel like Greek mythology, when I read it, I'm like, that happened. I don't know if that's normal. Does everybody else feel that way? I feel like growing up religious really does that to you. It was cool because we get to see these famous figures through the eyes of Circe. It was such a vulnerable story because Circe's truly on this healing journey, but she has all of eternity to do it. And it really captured the feelings of loneliness and isolation and love and purpose. And I think those are some of the most wonderful things to read about, and they go really well together. I'm realizing that a lot of my favorite themes involve immortality, free will, Greek mythology, female empowerment, family, and this book has all of those things and more. The way that she talked about gods and mortals was truly refreshing. A lot of the fantasy books that we read kind of romanticize being immortal, and Circe, this immortal demigod, romanticized mortals. Reading about mortals through her eyes was really cool, especially after reading books like Twilight. I read Twilight and I'm like, ugh, I wish I could live forever. And then I read a book like Circe and I'm like, wow, life is precious, it's amazing and beautiful. And so I feel like that's like a nice switch up from some of the fantasy books that are pretty mainstream. I read this book actually the slowest that I've read a book all year. This book took me a month to read. I really enjoyed the fact that it took so long because one of the main things that she's dealing with is being an immortal and being in isolation. And the fact that it took me a little bit longer to read was really nice because it gave me a little bit of sense of how long eternity is. Not that a month is anywhere close to eternity, but I did like that I didn't breeze through it, and it was just a book that I wanted to like spend a little more time with. I think that you will like this book if you like magic and hazy kind of worlds and Greek mythology, well depicted settings. The imagery was so stunning. I cannot say enough good things about just like the visuals that I got from reading her words about Circe's island were amazing. I loved it so much. And if you love like a well-developed setting that's talked about in just like this beautiful way, you'll definitely love Circe. I found a review on Reddit about this book that I think sums up some of what I was feeling that I was having a hard time putting into words. So I'm going to read it. And it says, the thing about Circe is that it felt like the right story. The way Miller wrote the story, it felt like the obvious path for it to take. In fact, it felt so familiar that I took for granted everything presented as what I had already known. Circe's origin, of course I'd heard that story. Her early life and turn to magic, naturally I knew how that happened. It wasn't until about halfway through the book that I realized Miller created much of the fantasy, that she wasn't just retelling an old story with fresh words, that most of the story was constructed from a handful of fragments she used for inspiration. And that realization changed and elevated the way I read the book. The way that she told the story just truly felt like the way the story was meant to be shared, like I was sitting around a campfire listening to someone spin a story I've heard a dozen times. It all clicked nearly perfectly. And I couldn't say it any better. Madeline Miller is an absolute genius, and she has a beautiful way with words, and you should read her books. I would recommend The Song of Achilles just as strongly as I would recommend Circe. They were both 5-star reads for me easily. You should read it. I think it's another one that you might not like if you like something a little more fast-paced and you like something a little more plot-driven, because some of the plot kind of felt like, instead of like building to a climax and then coming back down, it felt like a lot of little roller coaster moments, and I love that, but I think that if you don't love that, then it might not be the book for you. I don't know if that's like pretty aligned with how Greek mythology stories are told. I would love to look into that a little bit more. The final book I want to talk about is Basic AF. Everyone has read this book, and if you haven't, you definitely should, because I would love to read this book for the first time again. It is so deserving of all of the hype, and I really knew that I was gonna love it as soon as I picked it up, because the dedication says, for Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote American Psycho, which is another book that I really, really liked and that stuck with me for a really long time. The first sentence was also a huge hook. I want to read it to you because I feel like I read the first sentence and I was like, okay, cool, I'm into this book. I don't want to put it down. And a lot of times it takes me like 50 to 70 pages to get to that point in a book. So that was really cool that it became unputdownable from the second I picked it up. I also feel like that means that if you have a hard time getting into books, this is a great one to pick up. The first sentence goes, the snow in the mountains was melting and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation. Amazing, so talented. Donna Tartt, this is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And this book, if I could sum it up in one word, cold. It made me feel cold. The genre is dark academia. I think it's truly a modern classic, which is a term that I'm obsessed with and very fascinated by, thinking about what books are gonna become classics. Dark academia, maybe historical fiction. It was set in 1980 and written in 1992, so I don't know if that really constitutes historical fiction. Maybe psychological fiction, some elements of thriller. It was really just the blueprint for dark academia. But if you're interested in getting into that genre, this is a great book to start with. I don't actually think I've read anything else in that genre besides the book I'm reading now, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Some quotes from The Secret History that I love are, it's a very Greek idea and a very profound one. Beauty is terror. Whatever we call beautiful, we quiver before it. And what could be more terrifying and beautiful to souls like the Greeks or our own than to lose control completely? To throw off the chains of being for an instant, to shatter the accident of our mortal selves. Does such a thing as the fatal flaw, that showy dark crack running down the middle of a life, exist outside literature? I used to think it didn't. Now I think it does. And I think that mine is this, a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. And then a quote that like I just agree with so hard is, "It is better to know one book intimately than 100 superficially." That quote made me feel better about not having read 52 books in a year yet, even though I really want to. This book is about students in New England who are studying the classics under a very pretentious professor that they are absolutely obsessed with. There are a lot of secrets and studying and school vibes and lies and people digging themselves into holes, making horrible decisions, isolating themselves from the rest of the school and from the rest of society. I feel like those are some really big themes that are present. I read this book while I was going through kind of an emotional time in my life. I was traveling to Chicago and it was cold, and the last day of the trip I was by myself in a hotel room just reading this book, and I felt like it was just the perfect place to be reading this when I was like feeling a little moody, feeling a little bit lonely, letting myself sink into those feelings and experiencing this book and these characters who are experiencing cold and loneliness was amazing. Like, it was such a vibe. The characters are just this whirlwind. I think that if you don't like super pretentious characters, there is a chance that you might not like this book, but I don't usually like super pretentious characters, and I liked this book. So I think that unless you like hate them, you should be fine. It also slows down at the end and kind of goes into this lull before the action picks back up. And if you think that that sounds boring, which it was a little bit boring for like a little chunk of pages, then you might not like this book. But I think that since it happens towards the end, you push through naturally. I think that the book has, again, beautiful scenery, very Harry Potter winter feeling, not in terms of content, but in terms of vibe. It felt very melancholy at times, and the characters are morally ambiguous. I feel like feels more realistic, and then also just like makes me want to keep reading. I think that they're more like engaging and interesting than main characters that are perfect, and I feel like I enjoy the complexity of characters where you're not sure if you're like fully agreeing with, like, some of the things they do make sense, some of the things you're like, that's questionable. Maybe you should call the police. I felt like I traveled to Vermont when I was reading this book, and it was just stick season vibes to me. I was like, these kids in Vermont would have loved Noah Kahn. And then I was like, actually, they probably wouldn't have. And naturally, my curiosity led me to ChatGPT, and I forced it to guess if each of these characters would like Noah Kahn. ChatGPT did not want to give me this answer, but I persisted. And the TLDR was that Richard and Henry would have been too pretentious to enjoy Noah Kahn's music. Francis would have been the most likely to enjoy his music because of the depths of his emotions and the fact that he is artistic. Bunny would have liked it because it was popular, and Julian would have appreciated Noah Kahn's music as a form of modern artistic expression, which I thought was just the most spectacular prediction and felt like just reading Julian's words again. But these three books are my top 3 so far for this year. I'm hoping to add maybe another 2 to this stack and have a top 5. If you're looking for some good books for this winter, this holiday season, I think any of these books would be great choices, especially for winter. The Secret History, if you haven't read it, this is your sign to read it. And I truly do think that it will become a modern classic. And I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about modern classics. If you have any books that you would recommend that you think that I would like based on what I have said about these, I realized when I was putting together my thoughts on these 3 books and like choosing my top 3 for the year that I definitely have a type that I like, and I love historical fiction, which I never would have thought until I thought back and I was like, I guess those all were historical fiction. I love watching characters develop through a story, and really good writing style is so make or break for me. Even if the plot and characters are fantastic, if the writing style is like less than art, does kind of start to make me fall out of the story. But I'm reading Ninth House right now, and I feel like it's definitely gonna make the list of top 5. I'm about halfway through. I'm so excited. I hope that this video works, and I hope that I can upload it and edit it, and the editing doesn't take me 12 years. I hope that you can't see that my eye's watering, and I hope that you have a wonderful day and that you go buy one of these books. And if you disagree with any of my opinions, I would absolutely love to hear it in the comments. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.